On January 2nd, 1935, a young man checked into a downtown Kansas City hotel. He signed the register, he requested an interior room, and carried no luggage. Within days, he would be dead, and for weeks, no one would know who he really was. Kansas City in the winter of 1935 was busy and anonymous. Trains arrived constantly, salesmen passed through, hotels were filled with people who expected to stay briefly and leave without a trace. That afternoon, a young man walked into the hotel president. He approached the front desk and signed the registry under the name Roland T. Owen. He listed Los Angeles as his home address. At the time, nothing about this raised any suspicion. Hotel staff later described him as appearing to be in his early to mid-20s. He was clean-cut, neatly dressed, and well-spoken. He wore a dark overcoat and seemed physically healthy. But several employees would later say the same thing. He seemed nervous, not frantic or visibly panicked, just alert and watchful. He paid attention to the activity around him as if he were expecting someone or something. One employee later recalled a small physical detail. One of his ears appeared slightly misshapen, with a faint scar near the hairline. He requested an interior room away from the street, and he was assigned room 1046. A bellboy named Randolph Probst escorted him upstairs. Once inside, something subtle stood out. He had no luggage, no overnight bag, and no extra clothing. He removed only a comb, a brush, and a tube of toothpaste from his coat pocket and placed them on the sink. Later that afternoon, Probst saw him leave the hotel, but no one could later say with certainty when he returned. Later that afternoon, maid Mary Soptic went to room 1046 to clean. She knocked and there was no answer. Assuming the guest was out, she used her passkey and entered. The room was dark, and he was laying there, fully clothed, curtains drawn, lights off. He didn't react strongly to her presence. She apologized and cleaned what little there was to clean. There were no personal belongings beyond the comb, brush, and toothpaste on the sink. When she finished, she left. Not long after, Mary returned. He was still there, still fully dressed, still in a darkened room. This time, she noticed a handwritten note on the table. It read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." She did not ask who Dawn was, and before she left, he asked her to leave the door unlocked. He said he was expecting someone, so she did as she was asked. That evening, there was a party taking place on the same floor as room 1046. Music and voices carried through the hallway, guests moved in and out of rooms, and room 1046 was not isolated. At some point during the night, a woman came to the front desk asking about a room number. She believed she was supposed to meet someone, but no one in the room was answering. Some accounts suggest she may have been attempting to locate room 1046, though this was never conclusively confirmed. She left shortly after, and her identity was never firmly established. Later that night, guests reported hearing raised voices coming from the hallway near room 1046, not screaming or anything that prompted immediate concern, just the sounds of an argument blending into the noise of the party. By morning, the hallway was quiet again, and all was well. Mary returned to room 1046 the next morning. This time the door was locked, so she used her passkey. He was still inside, fully clothed, sitting on the bed. Um, while she was there, the phone had rung, and he answered it, and Mary overheard him say something along the lines of, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I just had breakfast." But still that name pops up again, Dawn. Mary finished her work and left. Later that same morning, she had returned again. This time she knocked, but she did not enter. She could hear more than one voice inside the room. When she offered what she had brought, a man answered, "We don't need any." Mary would later say the voice did not sound like the man she had spoken with earlier. It was different. It was shorter, rougher. So she had stepped away from the door and continued about her day. Not long after she had left, the hotel switchboard operator noticed that the telephone in room 1046 was off the hook. When a room phone stayed off the hook for too long, it disrupted the entire switchboard system, so they sent a bellboy upstairs. He knocked, and a voice had from the inside told him to come in and turn on the lights. When he tried the handle, the door didn't immediately open, and he didn't have his key. So he called back through the door and asked the occupant to place the receiver back on the hook. And then the bellboy returned back downstairs. A short time later, the phone then went off the hook again. He was sent back, and this time had his pass key. When he had entered, he found that the small table holding the telephone had been knocked over, and the receiver was off the hook, laying on the floor. So he righted the table and replaced the receiver. The room was still very dark. The man was still inside, still fully dressed, appearing weak and disoriented. There were dark stains along the bedding, and the assumption at the time was that he may have been drunk or ill. So the bellboy had left again, and a short time after, the switchboard had failed once more. So staff returned to room 1046, but this time they would not be leaving. When they entered, the room remained dark, the curtains were drawn, but the man was no longer on the bed. He was found on the floor near the doorway on his hands and elbows, his head lowered into his hands. There was blood throughout the room, on the bedding, on the walls, even on the ceiling. Police and emergency personnel then arrived. He was still alive, but just barely. Upon closer examination, it became clear that his wrists and ankles had been bound with cord. Despite his condition, officers questioned him at the hotel before he was transported. They asked if anyone else had been present, to which he had responded no. They then asked what had happened, and he told them that he had fallen, more specifically that he had fallen against the bathtub. He was then taken to the hospital, but unfortunately did not recover. So the police then examined room 1046. There was no luggage or wallet, no identification beyond the hotel registry. And the address listed under the name Roland T. Owen did not exist, nor did the name Roland T. Owen. The note from Dawn were collected, fingerprints were taken, and photographs were circulated. Newspapers described him as a man in his early to mid-20s, but no family came forward and no identity surfaced. For days, the man known as Roland T. Owen remained unclaimed. Arrangements were made for a burial in a pauper's grave. But before that could happen, the funeral home reportedly received a call. A man stated that he wished to pay for the burial, and payment was later received by mail. He requested a burial at Memorial Park Cemetery and asked that the grave be placed near a woman he referred to as the deceased sister. He insisted that the name Roland T. Owen remain on the marker, and the burial proceeded under that name. Not too long after that, flowers had arrived with a card that just said, "Love forever, Louise." It was reported that they later received another call. Some accounts say that the voice was described as female, and the caller stated that what the newspapers were reporting about the case were incorrect, that the young man had gotten himself into, quote unquote, a jam. In other accounts, a caller was quoted as saying, cheaters get what's coming to them. Whether these statements came from the same person was never definitively established, but someone paid, someone cared, and someone chose to remain unnamed. But in Birmingham, Alabama, a mother had begun to feel something was wrong. She had been receiving letters from her son that didn't sound like him. One had been typed, which is something that he didn't know how to do, and another claimed that he had lost a hand in Africa and couldn't write properly. But he didn't have a passport, he had never traveled overseas, and still had both hands. The explanations felt very off to the mother, and so when she saw a photograph in the newspaper, she had recognized him, and the family then contacted the authorities. And the name Roland T. Owen completely unraveled. The man in room 1046 was not in his mid-20s. He was 17 years old. And his real name was Artemis Ogletree. A boy described as a grown man traveling under an alias, whose final days were spent in a dark hotel room. The grave marker still read Roland T. Owen, but that never was who he was. Once Artemis Ogletree's identity was known, the story didn't suddenly make sense. In some ways, it became harder to understand because now every single detail has to be reconsidered through one fact. He was 17. Investigators were left with evidence but no answers, and fragments that never formed a full picture. At this point, there are no definitive answers. What exists instead are a handful of known theories and ideas formed from the evidence that was left behind and from the things that never quite made sense. So let's get into what's been suggested over the years. The most commonly discussed theory is that Artemis knew the person or people involved. The handwritten note addressed to Dawn, the phone call overheard by Mary, and the repeated use of that same name. None of it suggests a random encounter. If Dawn was someone Artemis trusted, that would explain why he was allowed into the room. why the room had been left unlocked earlier, and why he never identified anyone to the police. This theory suggests whatever happened in room 1046 was not accidental, it was personal. Another theory focuses less on who was responsible and more on Artemis's refusal to explain what happened. Despite being found bound and seriously injured, he told police that he had fallen against the bathtub, but that explanation doesn't align with physical evidence. But fear of retaliation of someone with power over him, or fear that telling the truth would only make things worse. If Artemis believed staying quiet was the safer option, his explanation may have been intentional, even if it cost him his life. The events following his death add another layer. Someone paid for his burial, requested that his alias remain on the gravestone, and someone had sent flowers and challenged how the story was being reported. Whether these actions came from one individual or several has never been confirmed, but they suggest that Artemis was not alone as he appeared to be, and that at least one person knew far more than they ever publicly admitted. Finally, there's the possibility that Artemis was attempting to live beyond his years, traveling alone at 17 using a false name and carrying no luggage, sending letters that didn't sound like him. It suggests a boy caught in a situation he didn't fully understand, something that escalated faster than he could control. Not a hardened criminal or a drifter, just someone in over his head. And with that, we end the theories, because without new information, none of this can be proven. Room 1046 remains unsolved, not because no one looked, but because the truth was never fully given. Artemis Ogletree was identified but never received justice. He was 17 years old and far from home, using a name that wasn't his, and nearly a century later the same questions remain. Who was Dawn? Who paid for the funeral? Who sent the flowers? And who was in that room with him during his final hours? Someone knew what happened, they just never told the truth. Until those answers surface, room 1046 remains exactly what it has always been, a place where the answer stopped just short of the door. I'm Jo, and this is Shadows of Truth. Thanks for listening.